Good afternoon and welcome to Grant Professional Association's webinar titled So You Want to Be a Consultant. My name is Kelly Romero and I'm the Membership Director for GPA and your webinar moderator for today. You will be placed in listen-only mode. If you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the chat box on the left side of your screen or raise your hand to submit your questions. We will get to as many questions as time permits. At the end of the webinar, you will be directed to a brief survey. We ask that you please fill it out to assist us with future webinars. Let's get started. Today's presenters are Lysakowski and Susan Schaefer. Linda, who is an ACFRE, is one of fewer than 100 professionals worldwide to hold the Advanced Certified Fundraising Executive designation. In her 19 years as a philanthropic consultant, she has managed capital campaigns, helped dozens of nonprofit organizations achieve their development goals, and trained more than 22,000 professionals in Mexico, Canada, Egypt, and most of the 50 United States in all aspects of development. Linda is an AFP Certified Master Trainer and serves on the board of AFP Foundation for Philanthropy. She has received 2 AFP research grants. She is also a prolific writer and is always working on another book or 2 or 3. Linda has received the Outstanding Fundraising Executive Award from both the Eastern Pennsylvania and the Las Vegas chapters of AFP, and in 2006 was recognized internationally in Atlanta, Georgia with the Barbara Marion Award for Outstanding Service to AFP. Linda is also a graduate of the Lay Ecclesial Ministry Program, Diocese of Las Vegas, and is active in her church in Boulder City, Nevada. Our second presenter is Susan Schaefer. She is also a CFRE and is founder and principal of Resource Partners, LLC. Susan is an accomplished writer who specializes in helping nonprofits succinctly tell their stories. Those stories have translated into powerful case statements and proposals that have led to multi-million-dollar grants from the nation's largest funders. Prior to her consulting work, Susan served as National Director of Foundations at the United Negro College Fund. There she helped lead the design and implementation of one of the largest private grants in history, a $1 billion 20-year program funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Susan is a regular presenter at regional and national forums. Volunteer service is a constant in her life, and she regularly holds leadership positions on the boards on which she serves. Susan holds a master's degree in non-for-profit management and a bachelor's degree in English, both from the University of Maryland, where she graduated Phi Beta Kappa. Ladies, please feel free to begin your presentation. Dial *7 to unmute your lines, please.
Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. I just wanted to point out, Kelly, that we have someone who said he can't hear anything, so you might need to give him the phone number to dial in. I don't know if you noticed his question in the chat box. So I wanted to point that out before we get started. And hopefully all of you are able to see the slides and hear both of Susan and myself. It's always great to be presenting with Susan because you probably picked up in our introduction that we're about 3,000 miles away from each other, but we've spent a lot of time working together on our new book and also on webinars and conferences, so we kind of feel like we're best friends even though we live so far away from each other. But we'd like to, of course, learn a little bit more about you, and since there's about 50 of you on the line, we certainly won't have time for personal introductions. But one question that we would like to start out with is a poll that will tell us, what your situation is as far as how long you've been in the consulting field. And, of course, my slide is not moving now for some strange reason. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so we're going to ask you to fill in one of the blocks on this poll. How long have you been consulting? More than a year, 6 months to 1 year, less than 6 months, or are you just thinking about consulting? So if you'll take a minute or so to answer one of those questions, that'll give us a little bit better handle on what your level of experience is. Now somebody answered theirs in the chat box. You should be able to go to the poll and just check one of those boxes. I see some people are sending us their answers in the chat box instead of the poll. I'm not sure if you're having trouble with the poll. Okay, I think we might be having some trouble with the poll.
It should be on, just saying it's not interactive.
I'm not sure what's happening here.
A lot of people.
The poll will not accept an answer. Apparently there's something. Well, 2 people did answer, it looks like, that are just thinking about it. So let me just kind of look through the chat room. We have some people that say more than a year, 6 months to a year, less than 6 months. Less than 6 months. A lot of the majority of people seem to be just thinking about it. I apologize. I'm not sure what's happening with the poll. It worked a minute ago when we were testing it out, but it looks like most of you are either just thinking about becoming a consultant or you're in the consulting field for less than 6 months or some maybe more than a year. So we have kind of a variety, but I would say the majority of people, based on the answers I see in the chat room, are in the stage of just thinking about consulting. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan and let her tell you a little bit about why most people go into consulting and why some of you may be considering.
Thanks, Linda. This is Susan Schaefer. As Linda said, I'm on the East Coast in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. So Linda and I have done a lot of work together this year, and it's a real thrill to talk to everyone today because the reason we have spent so much time together largely in the past year and a half or so is that we've been putting together a book about the field of consulting, because for those of you who have started your own businesses, you know that there really is very little out there about starting a consulting business in the nonprofit sector. And frankly, this was just a labor of love for the two of us who have now been doing this work for quite a long time. And the feedback we got was tremendous, and we look forward to presenting some of it to you today. The basic question about why consulting, for most people, I think it comes down to options. And the way to synopsize most of these options are yes, but, because there are so many options that you really need to prioritize for yourself. So does consulting give you better hours? Maybe the answer is yes, but if better means more, then that's a relative response, because many of us do end up working as many or more hours than we did before, but they're a little more flexible. As Linda and I can attest on working on this book recently, we've been working at all hours of the day and night and weekends and the rest of it, and that really goes for the whole of consulting practices. Do you receive more pay? Yes, per hour, but maybe not, depending on where you are now. If you're at a large established organization, it may be difficult to acquire the same amount of pay, specifically in the first few years that you're in business. Once you're established, you can often get to that point. And we'll talk at the very end about setting fees and how to try to make sure that you do get your fees up to where they need to be so that you can lead the same or better lifestyle than you've been leading as a staff person. And again, the freedom to set your own schedule, well, yes, and maybe, because while you can feel free to set the schedule you like, and I know plenty of consultants in our field who set their schedules from 8 to 6 or 9 to 5, whatever it may be, and they cut it off at that point. As all of you know, it is very difficult these days to get away from the ever-vibrating cell phones and ringing of text messages and all the rest of it. So you really have to be very disciplined to feel that you can step away from your work. So many of us, because we're passionate about the sector, do end up working quite a bit. So it takes a lot of discipline. The ability to work at home, of course, is a big piece, and as we'll get into in a few minutes, if you are in the grants field, that's one of the best niches in the consulting world in terms of working at home. Very easy to set up shop, and we'll get into that in detail soon. And how about the variety of work? Yes, there's certainly variety for those of you who want it, and then there are plenty of grants professionals who really find a niche and thrive in that niche. So my experience, for instance, began in the higher education world, and I had a number of jobs, as Kelly mentioned, United Negro College Fund, a couple of universities and associations. So when I started on my own, higher education was my natural niche for a while. And I'll be honest, I was chomping at the bit to start working with a greater variety of clients. And I eventually did, but it did take patience because all of my contacts were in that higher education field. So I do caution you as a new consultant to be conservative in your choices and look for your strengths initially. And then I have to say it was probably 2 or 3 years ago when for the first time after consulting for 12 years, I had finally no higher education clients. And that's not to say I wouldn't take them again, but I had come to the point in my consulting career where I was known in many other circles and not just higher education. So there can certainly be a variety of work when you want there to be. Okay, and now we're going to turn it back to Linda for a minute to get to our next poll, and hopefully this one will work. If not,
yeah, maybe this one at least seems to have circles there, so I think we're in good shape.
Yes, this one looks good.
And like Susan, I also came from a background of higher education and museum work, but I realized when I went into consulting that I wanted a lot more variety in my work, so that was one of the key factors for me. So again, we're going to ask you, and you probably have more than one reason, but if it only allows you to push one, I'm not sure if this will allow you to make more than one selection, but pick the one that you think is the most important to you, whether it's better hours, more pay, the freedom to set your own schedule, the ability to work at home, the variety of work. And to be honest, we haven't mentioned this one, but sometimes people go into consulting just because they're between jobs and they're not quite sure where they want to go next. Maybe they want to try consulting, and if they don't like it, then go back and look for another job within a certain sector. So looks like pretty many people have completed this. Let's see. I'm kind of happy to see that no one has said better hours, because I chuckled when Susan mentioned better hours, because those of us who have been in consulting for any length of time will probably find that you're working at least as many hours as you worked when you were in a staff position, most likely a lot more. I think Susan and I often joke about this because she's on the East Coast and I'm on the West Coast, and I'm oftentimes ready for bed and I'm emailing her thinking I'll get a response the next morning, and sure enough I get a response at what's probably midnight her time, so I know she's still working. But it looks like we're kind of evenly divided, other than nobody's looking for better hours. The most popular ones are freedom to set your own schedule, which I think is a great thing. And for me, this is really important, because even though I work probably 60 to 80 hours a week, at least I can work on the hours I want to do. And yesterday I actually took a day off and left Sunday for an overnight trip and came back yesterday afternoon, so that was kind of great. The ability to work at home, we're going to talk more about where you should work. Some of you probably find that very important. The variety of work, I think, is a real bonus of consulting, so I think you'll find that that's really popular for a lot of people. So let's move on and talk a little bit about whether you think you're really cut out to be a consultant. And this is a question that a lot of people ask themselves when they're going into this. And frankly, being a consultant looks like a really glamorous job. I know that within my first month that I was in the field of development, I was working in the higher education, and we had a consultant that we worked with, and I used to think, boy, does he have a great job. He comes in here and he goes and has breakfast with the president of the university, and then he comes over and works in the development office a little bit, and then we usually go out for lunch, and the next thing I know, he's gone, and we don't see him again for another month. And I thought, gee, that's really pretty nice work if you can get it. Of course, after I got into this field, and next week actually, I celebrate my 20th year, so I'll have to change my bio for the next webinar. But after 20 years in business, I think it's not really as easy as it looks. So some things that you have to think about if you want to see if you are ready to be a consultant or not is whether or not you can work independently, or are you the kind of person who really needs a team to support you. And I can tell you that when I started my business, I recognized that one of my biggest weaknesses, and it's probably still a big weakness, is that I'm not a technology expert. And I found myself working with a lot of organizations that really needed help with things like how do they get their donors into a donor database. So before I even got started right in business, I went out on day one and rented an office and hired a person that was a real technical expert. And he was able to help me not only with tracking my system to track my clients, but also was able to help a lot of our clients and did a lot of database work for them as well. So I at first realized that I really did need that team a little bit to support me. But then as I grew my business, I found that I at one point in time had about 7 subcontracting consultants that worked for me. Only the most paid staff I ever had was probably 4, but I had 4 paid staff and about 7 or 8 outside subcontracted consultants. And after a while, I realized that one of the reasons I liked consulting was that I didn't have to manage a whole staff of people, and the next thing I knew, I was managing a staff of people. So I'm now down to myself and one support person who does a lot of my financial and bookkeeping and that type of work. So that's a big question for you. If you're somebody who really can't work well by yourself, maybe you really need to think about consulting, or think about it in a different way. Maybe you go to work for an already established consultant, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too. Another thing that I think is really knowing your personality. Are you capable, both personality-wise and financially, are you capable of living with that famine and fluctuating income? Because when I got started in my business, I was very fortunate. I had a husband who was working, and I didn't have to be totally dependent on my salary, although we had sort of come to depend on that salary. But you do in consulting have that feast or famine phenomenon that I think you'll never see working as a staff person, because you don't know sometimes where your next business is coming from. And in our book, we've heard from different consultants who said, that they found that in most cases the work kind of balanced out, but sometimes you're so busy that you can't take time to breathe, and the next thing you know, you don't have any clients at all because all your contracts ended at the same time. So you really have to juggle that stuff very carefully. The other thing is, can you really multitask? And I think some people just are not good at multitasking. I find that a lot of people are, especially women. I hate to draw the line here, but I find women are really good at multitasking, probably because if they've ever had children, they've had to juggle a lot of things at one time. But balancing multiple clients can be rather challenging at times, and you also have to be able to shift gears easily. You might be working with a museum and a hospital and a human service agency and maybe a performing arts center all at one time, and all of a sudden, you're in healthcare mode 1 minute, and the next hour you're thinking about the arts clients, and how can you shift gears between the different clients, and how do you manage the different deadlines, particularly if you're going to be a grant writing consultant. Now, my consulting is not in the field of grant writing. Susan does a lot more of that than I do, but with grant writing, I think you have really tight deadlines a lot of times that you have to, maybe one client has a proposal that's due, and the next client has another proposal that's due on the same day or the day after, so you really have to juggle a lot. The other thing that you have to think about is how much travel do you want to do? And I confess that when I started my business, this was one of the attracting things to me, was I wanted the opportunity to travel a lot. But after I did enough of it, sometimes it really got a little frustrating. I remember last summer I was on a plane 7 days in a row, and I thought even the flight attendants get a day off, and here I was 7 days in a row in airports and on airplanes. So this is something to think about, because depending on how much you want to travel, that's going to depend on how you focus your business. So if you don't like travel and you want to focus locally, you have to think about whether there's enough business in your local area to support your business. Maybe you'll have to expand regionally. Maybe you want to say, well, I don't mind traveling to another city, but as long as it's driving distance. Or maybe you want to be a national consultant and you want to get around and see different parts of the world, or even international. Of course, international consulting has its own share of nightmares that go along with it, in addition to the travel. The other thing, I think, that you are going to be able to have to work long and sometimes very strange hours. Even though your schedule is more flexible, it doesn't mean that you can really take much time off. And I know for me, with age of smartphones, as Susan said, it's really hard to get away from clients. And I actually prefer it that way. When I travel, I would rather read my email and respond to as much of it as I can so I don't face 300 emails when I come home, which I sometimes do. So those are some questions to ask yourself about whether or not you are cut out to be a consultant. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan now and let her talk a little bit more about the different types of consulting that are out there for you.
Great. Thanks, Linda. And ditto on that idea about taking your smartphone on vacation. I hate to advocate for it, but really these days, how many of us do take vacations without responding to some email? The sad state of affairs these days. Well, in terms of the type of consultant you think about being, I think this is an important conversation even for those of you who have been consulting for a while. And I'll be honest, even as someone who's consulted for a long time now, I find myself thinking about these issues a lot. It's really important to be able to define yourself. We talk about the organizations where we work and helping them create their 30-second elevator pitch. And that's important for you as a consultant to have as well. And many times your business can start to shift gears without you knowing about it. And it's really important that you not take jobs just because they're available to you, but because they fall into a niche that you are really expert at and a niche that you really want to pursue. So I encourage you, whether you're thinking about consulting or there already, think about what kind of practice you would like to have for yourself. Would you like it to be single-focused, meaning do you only want to do, for instance, grant writing, or do you want it to be something broader than that? If you have not yet started your practice and you're coming out of either a grants writing or grants management position, it is a great idea to think seriously about starting out in that niche specifically. I'll be really honest, when I left my last office job and started consulting, I was chomping at the bit to just have variety in all facets of my consulting practice, and I had plenty of experience doing things that were not related to grants. However, I had worked for the last 6 years in a grants-related job, and frankly, everyone in my area knew me as a grants person. So when I attempted to hang out a shingle that said I would do more than that, the only requests I was getting for a while there were for grants. And I realized very quickly, you know what, I need to embrace the fact that I've got this area of expertise where I'm recognized and where people have seen my work recently. And what happened was that I would get hired to do grants, and then when people were satisfied with that work, they would inevitably ask me to work on other projects. And I would accept those where I was qualified, and I would subcontract out or refer out the projects where I thought they were beyond my interest at that point. So certainly embrace what you have, and decide, even in terms of creating a business plan for yourself, what you would like to ultimately become. So if you start with grants, would you like to move into capital campaigns or something else? Also think about the client focus. We spoke earlier about the discipline areas in which you work. Is that where you'd like to stay? Because if so, you may be attending conferences to meet people in those areas. You may be reading up in those areas. It really makes a difference if you're going to have a specialty these days, that you immerse yourself constantly in that discipline area. And if you're like Linda and myself, we love learning about the missions of new organizations, and that's really what keeps us going. And that's a whole different type of consultant. You put yourself out there to get variety for yourself. And as Linda already acknowledged, having a one-person shop is very different from the dream of pursuing a medium or even a large firm. And I should say, in the process of writing this book, we got to talk and read the work of a lot of consultants, and many of them had gone on this really interesting, I thought, trajectory from starting out on their own to amassing a good number of subcontractors and even employees. And many of them, after 15 or 20 years, were back doing it alone again. So that's certainly not something that should steer you away from the idea of hiring staff, but But it's something to think about. There really is, as Linda said, a different kind of a business model when you start hiring a lot of people. You end up doing a lot more of the management and a lot less of the actual work. So give those issues a lot of thought. They will really become critical to the everyday work that you do. So we'll move in now to a couple of polls that get at those very issues.
Right, and the first one, we only gave you two choices here because we assume since this is GPA that most of you are thinking about or already are grants consultants. So one question is, some of you that's all you want to focus on. I'm sure there's a lot of you who really strictly want to focus on grants because that's your area of expertise. Some of you, like Susan, may be looking more at providing full services beyond just grants. So let's we'll give you a couple more seconds to fill this out. People are still adding to this. And you may find yourself falling in some other category. Maybe it's not really full service, but maybe it's grants and strategic planning or grants and annual campaigns. But actually it looks like so far the majority of you, there's still some answers coming in, but the majority of you are planning to focus especially on grants as your sole focus. And I think this is great if this is your area of expertise, because you can become known for something that maybe people, and grants is something that a lot of times organizations are more willing to subcontract than they are some other types of development. So those of you who are focusing on grant writing only, I think you can certainly have a lot of people to choose from. The other nice thing about grant writers is that you can do a lot of your work remotely. You can have clients all over the country, but you might not need to travel as much because most of your work is done behind your desk doing the research and doing the writing. For those of you who are looking at full service, you may find yourself fluctuating back and forth in your consulting practice too. You may start out with one emphasis. I know when I started out, my emphasis was that I was not going to do capital campaigns. I felt going into this that there were so many consultants that at least I was aware of in my area, and this was at that time I lived in Pennsylvania, and there were so many consulting firms around doing capital campaigns. So I decided that I thought, oh gosh, I'm not going to do capital campaigns. I'm not going to go up against all that competition. I'm going to focus on small organizations and getting them started with a development program, maybe hiring their first development staff, putting their database systems in place or policies or procedures or development plans, board development. Those were the kind of things that I really wanted to focus on. And to this day, I still do not focus on grant writing. I never wanted to focus on that. I've done it occasionally for most of my clients, but I'm usually looking for grant writers like all of you people to refer that business out to. But eventually what I found in my career was that even though I went into this thinking I wasn't going to do capital campaigns, I started finding that there were a lot of smaller organizations, or at least organizations with small development offices or no development office, but they needed to do a capital campaign. So then I started getting into more capital campaigns. Usually they were under $1 million mark. But eventually, as my reputation and my experience grew, I started doing more larger capital campaigns of $3 to $5 million, and then $10 million, and $20 or $30 million. Today, I'm back to the point where I really don't want to do too many capital campaigns because of the travel involved. So now I'm working mostly on local projects for capital campaigns, though I'll go nationally to do things like board training and board education. So you might go into this thinking all you want to do is grants, and maybe after a few years you'll find that people are coming to you for other things. In fact, I think a couple people put in, one person I know wrote in, they want full service around grants and strategy, but not a fundraising person right now. And then someone has a question here. What if your area of expertise is really only grants, but you want experience in other areas? And that, I think, is a great question, so I want to address it now while I'm on there, because I actually had some experience with this. For a while I had a business partner, and my business partner was primarily involved in grant writing, but she wanted to branch out and do more. So she teamed up with me because I had experience in capital campaigns, and it was a great match because I did not like the grant writing part of it. So we did a lot of work on capital campaigns where she would do the grant writing part of it, and I did the community fundraising part of the capital campaign. So one of the things I would suggest is if you feel you want to expand your area, team up with another person or persons, maybe a group of people that you can either work as associates, one person could be hiring the other people as subcontractors, or you can simply just make referrals back and forth to each other. But a lot of times serving as kind of an apprentice is a great way to get around this. So I think those are some areas. The other thing that you might do is look for a mentor or a coach. In fact, at the end of this session, we'll tell you a little bit about some mentoring and coaching that Susan and I are doing to help people with in a consulting organization that maybe doesn't have experience in some areas but wants to gain that experience. So those are some great questions. We have one more poll that we'd like to do, and this is the area of, do you want to focus on a single type of organizations? I find that there are many people who have been born and bred in the healthcare industry, for example, and they really only want to work in healthcare because that's their love and they feel like they have a real expertise. Or maybe you only enjoy working in the arts, and that's where you want to focus your energies. And this is going to be important because this is going to help you determine how wide a geographic net you need to cast. Because if you're going to only work in higher education and there's only 2 colleges and universities in your community, that means you're probably going to want to expand to a more national network. Same goes for any other types of organizations too. So being a single focus does give you some geographic limitations, but it also gives you the opportunity to be known as the real expert in that particular area. So I think you can make up your mind what works best for you, and it looks like the majority of you are like Susan and myself who enjoy working with all types of organizations. But either one of these methods is fine. What you really need to do is just determine what is your own interest, because you're going to be happiest and you're going to be the most successful if you really like to get out and do something that you think you're really good at, whether it's single focus or whether you want the variety of large organizations. One of our participants says she's thinking of a single focus like environmental sustainment, but offer my services to several organizations throughout the country. And I think that's a great method because you can be the expert. I know I've worked with some people who are experts in museum fields, and that's all they work with. I have a friend of mine who's a consultant to museums, not in fundraising, more in setting up their programs and their governance structure and things like that. But he only likes working with museums, so he's made a real niche for himself in pretty much the whole western part of the United States. So these are decisions, again, that I think are really important for you to think about. So I'm going to turn it back over to Susan, who's going to talk to you a little bit about where you want to work. And this, again, may change throughout your career, too.
It may, and I have to say for this particular crowd, I'm not even going to spend too much time on where you will work because there are certainly advantages to having an office outside your house, and I would say the primary one, well, the primary two, you don't, there are just some people whose personal styles are not suited for working at home. They find things like laundry, which they usually detest, as suddenly a great attraction when they are working from home and a deterrent from doing their work. So you'll know yourself, or you'll find out quickly if you're that type of person. But I should say for most other reasons, if you're a grant writer, you are, or in grants in whatever nature, working from home is probably one of the best options for grants people because the cost is low. The prestige factor, let's be honest, when people are writers, they don't usually expect that you work in a downtown high-rise. So there are a lot of advantages to working from home if you know your personality and you think you can do it. The other piece of it is that often as a grant writer, you will not need usually the kind of office conference space that other nonprofit consultants would often utilize to meet clients. It's often good to meet someone in their offices, meet your clients, that is, in their offices, and then you're doing much of the work off-site anyway. So certainly you have the option to work outside the home, but of all the types of nonprofit consultants, working from home is probably the most realistic for those of us in the grants field. So we're very lucky about that. I'm going to let us move on to the next slide because I know there are lots of detailed issues we'll want to get into. And working from home, there's lots you can read about that on the web and in our book if you want to hear from other consultants on the subject. So we'll move along from here.
Okay. Before we go on to this slide, I did notice something that made me sort of chuckle. Mary Alice writes, she works primarily out of her house, but finds in the winter when it's cold that the isolation is horrible. Now, living in the desert where we have to contend with 115-degree temperatures, I don't find that personally that I can able to relate to it currently, although I did work in Pennsylvania, and I think it just goes to show you how different personalities are. My personality would tell me that it is in the wintertime when it's cold, that would be the time I'd want to stay in my home because I didn't have to get out and deal with snow and ice on the roads as I did many times in Pennsylvania when I lived there. So now I don't have to ever worry about a client canceling a meeting because the snow hasn't been plowed on their parking lot yet, which I had to deal a lot with when I was in Pennsylvania.
You know, Linda, if I could just interrupt for 1 second. It's a really good point, and I'm sorry, Mary Alice, I didn't see your note until I had passed things along to Linda. But it is worth saying that if your personality is such that you, for whatever reason, don't think you can stay in the house all year or all day, there are many alternative arrangements these days where consultants are renting one small space out of colleagues' office spaces. So if you know of a larger consulting firm, for instance, and as Linda mentioned, if you can find a partnership with a group that does consulting to the nonprofit sector, and particularly if writing is not one of their strong points, you might be able to find a room within their office, and suddenly you've got yourself business leads as well as a space. Other times companies just sometimes look to rent out single offices, and then you're able to share their back office space and administration, and you've got an office to yourself. So there are also virtual offices these days where you can rent a space but not have to be there every day, and even use their conference space and receptionist services and those sorts of things. So if you live in a larger, more urban area, you may have those sorts of options as well. So I don't mean to completely write off the idea of grant writers working outside of the home, but I'd say probably, gosh, at least 90% of the ones I know do. But again, it all comes down to your personality.
And I think speaking of personality, it's interesting when we ask different authors. I believe we had about 4 articles about where to work in our book. Some of them were advocating home, some were advocating an outside office. But people have different views about the joys of working in your pajamas. Some people say it's great that I can be in my pajamas or in sweatpants or in shorts or whatever and work. Others say to make themselves feel professional, they have to get up and get dressed. And I remember once reading a consultant that wrote, she got up every morning, got dressed, and walked around the block and then walked back into her office. And it gave her a feeling that she was going somewhere to an office. So sometimes I think it depends a lot on your personality. I've had kind of the gamut of locations. I started my practice day one renting an office space because I felt like I just didn't think I was cut out to work at home. And I needed to have that office to go to. And I also had an employee too, so I didn't really have the space to have an employee come into my home. Then I moved my office. I was at the time living in a 2-unit home. We lived on the first floor, and there was an apartment upstairs. and that apartment became vacant. And I said, I think I'm just going to turn that into an office, because at that stage I had my mother living with me, and I didn't want to leave too far. I didn't want to be too far away from home during the day. But I found that I did have to go outside and up around the house and up the stairs to go to the second floor, and it was going to another office, and I actually never felt like I was at home there. I was totally removed, even though my home was right downstairs. Now I'm working out of my home, and I love every minute of it. In fact, I'm sitting here right now teaching this webinar and watching the hummingbirds feed at my hummingbird feeder. So working at home to me has a lot of advantages. Another thing that we do want to cover is how to structure your company. This is always a big question for a lot of people, and we're not here to give you legal advice. Neither of us are lawyers or accountants, and we certainly recommend that you talk to your own attorney and accountant about what's the best way to structure your business. But when I started my business, there actually was no such thing as an LLC, at least in Pennsylvania there wasn't. So I started my business as a subchapter S corporation because I did not want the personal liability attached to the business, so I didn't want to be a sole proprietor. And then at one time, I've done just about everything on here except the sole proprietor. I started as a subchapter S. Most consultants, if they're going to be a corporation, they're usually not a C Corp unless they're very big. Now, of course, there's this new B Corps, which are socially responsible, and I don't know if any of your consulting practices would fit into that, but if they have B Corps in your state, you might want to look into it. I know that Maryland has it. I believe Pennsylvania and New Jersey have it, and Nevada is actually thinking about approving B Corps. They may have already passed the legislation. So that's another option that we didn't even list on here. Partnership, obviously, if you're going to have a partner, is a good idea. But I think most consultants now that I'm talking to are going for the LLC because you do have that limited liability corporation, which means that you're not personally responsible. It kind of separates you from your personal assets. It separates the business from that. There may be some of you who are still sole proprietors, and that's fine too. Again, talk to your attorney or your accountant and decide which is the best option for you, because each of these have some things that, for example, if you're a corporation, you're supposed to have a board of directors and regular meetings and take meeting minutes. You have a corporate seal. There's a lot more involved than being an LLC or a sole proprietor. And, of course, partnerships can be interesting. I had a partnership that was dissolved kind of mutually. We just decided to go our separate ways because we had changed our business-focused goals. So a partnership is probably one of the most challenging of these, but if you have someone that you feel you can work well with, certainly look into some of those type of things. The next thing that we want to talk a little bit about is some legal issues that you need to know. And I think this is really important because whether you're a grant writer or a full-service consultant, many states, probably most states, actually require that you register as fundraising counsel or as professional solicitors. Some may even have a special category for grant writers. I know in Nevada recently they have never required anyone to register, and then 2 years ago they decided to make grant writers register but not other consultants, which makes no sense to me at all. But and they're still looking at that and possibly tweaking that registration. But it is something that you need to be aware of, particularly if you're going to work nationally, because even if the state you live in, now living in Nevada, I am not required to register as fundraising counsel, but I often work in other states, so I'm required to register in California, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Florida, and many, many other states that I've worked in. And registration can get pretty expensive, so this might be a good thing to help you decide whether or not you do want to expand the scope of your work, because some states like New York State has a very high registration fee, and some of these states, even though I never handle money, make me get bonded, and I have to go to an insurance company and pay for a bond too. So you have to check into all of that, and there's a whole section in our book, actually, an article and a whole chart with all the state registration requirements. You also need to know the IRS regulations about contractors versus employees. If you're going to hire employees or hire subcontractors, you need to be aware of a lot of regulations about that, because the IRS has a definite set of criteria that make someone an employee. And sometimes I find that people who say they're consultants are actually employees of an organization, because the organization, they may be only working for one organization who gives them an office, business cards, and everything else, but they call them a contracted employee. And sometimes employers will try to use this as a ruse to kind of eliminate paying payroll taxes, and the IRS will definitely frown upon that. So you want to look at things like, are you hiring contractors? Are you hiring employees? And are you being hired as a contractor or an employee? Because you can get yourself into some serious issues with these things if you don't talk to an accountant and an attorney. You also need to know the tax laws in different states. If you work in different states, are you going to be responsible for completing tax forms in those particular states? So again, look into all of these things. And liability issues, you should definitely have some type of professional liability insurance. And again, we're not attorneys or accountants or insurance agents, but look into all of these things, because you can get yourself into some serious problems if you don't have them. So I want to turn it over to Susan, because I know you're all dying to hear about marketing your business, which is a big aspect, especially for those of you who are new or just thinking about getting into it. So Susan, it's all yours.
Thank you. Really, we don't want to spend more time on all the fun legal issues?
Right.
You know, Linda is right that those issues that she just covered do seem very daunting. And so when you are starting out, it is important to look at the states where you'll be planning to do most of your work and figure out how things operate there, and then just branch out gradually. It will make the process seem less daunting. You know, and once you get moving, like with anything else, these things become routine. But it certainly is worth finding a good accountant who works with small businesses regularly to help you through some of those initial months and years. So let's talk about something a little more fun and creative than taxes, marketing your business. And I have to say that the best thing to me about this area is that you can really just go so many directions with it. I have to admit, my guilty admission is that I am not somebody who's done much social media marketing for my business, and yet, again, the strength of your business will be built around the strengths that you find yourself in personally, as well as all of these questions and polls we've taken so far. When you start taking the data about where you want to work, what kind of clients you want to have, your main goal is to reach those audiences. And so for me, for instance, coming from jobs where I had to previously do a lot of travel all over the country and had a long commute, I was very excited about having clients that were somewhat more local, at least on a regular basis. I do take clients from out of state, but I live, thankfully, near a large city, Washington, D.C., that has plenty of nonprofits, and so a lot more of my marketing is local. So should you have things like a website and some collateral materials, a one-pager, that sort of thing, those things are terrific for everybody. And frankly, the best thing about my website, I was in business for a few years before I launched it, and right away it cut down on the number of people who would call me for something that I didn't offer. And frankly, that was the biggest first benefit I noticed from a website, is that people can read about you and determine themselves if you are somebody who they should even call to begin conversations about a project. So it saved a lot of time initially, and it does allow you to put up some testimonials and get to your experience a bit. So these days they can be simple, or they can be something like Linda's websites, which are full of information and a draw in of themselves to clients. So if you're someone who does like to write and you want to post a lot of free material or even charge for it, you can make your website a place, a destination, so to speak. That said, plenty of people are getting a lot of business these days through social media, through LinkedIn, through their blogs. So I don't at all discourage you from doing that, particularly if you want to work nationally And even if you don't, they can often just help you make a name for yourself. Your blogs can get picked up by other people, and your tweets can get retweeted, and suddenly people know your name. And that sort of exposure allows you, if nothing else, to start raising your prices potentially, and just becoming a more credible consultant even in your early years. So if you are an ideas person, social media in particular is a great way to get started. Professional organizations, you heard in Linda's bio that she has made a tremendous name for herself doing a lot of work through the Association of Fundraising Professionals. And GPA obviously has a lot of terrific benefits as well. So if you concentrate a lot of your volunteer time in even one organization, you can really get a lot of clients that way. We haven't touched on this yet, but some of the best contacts you will make are not nonprofits at all, but are other consultants, because all of us are always looking to partner with others, even informally, to supplement our own weaknesses or to supplement our time when we don't have enough time. So when you get involved in these groups, you get to know people well, and you get to know potential clients as well as consultants who can help plug the holes when things are slow. We're running short on time, so I want to say that the next few listings on this page are pretty obvious: networking, advertising, speaking and writing are tremendous ways to get your name out there. So I certainly encourage you to do those things. The writing, whether it's blogs, articles, it doesn't pay much, but if at all, but it certainly does build credibility, and people will get to know your names for that reason. And let's spend some time now on setting fees. And this is a perpetually difficult conversation for people. There's no easy method. And the best thing that you can do, whether you're thinking about it or you've been in business for a while, is to ask around. Ask organizations that fit the profile of your ideal client how much they have paid for similar services. You can ask other consultants. People really are forthcoming once you start asking the questions. Once you have gathered that type of information, and of course this is all very geographically based, and even based on what type of organization you want to work for. Higher education and often healthcare, for instance, will likely pay more than grassroots human services organizations. That's pretty obvious. But you need to figure out, too, what you need. So all of these items on the left side of your screen are the items that you need to begin to create to see how much you need to make as a consultant. And these are all of your personal costs as well as some of the business costs. And then once you add that up, you need to, usually at the beginning, start breaking it down into an hourly rate. And granted, it sounds like consultants make a lot of money, but those hourly costs have to take into consideration the fact that we are not ever in our careers doing 8 or 10 hours of paid work every day, 50 hours a week. There are always times where you're spending time marketing, you're spending time teaching, you're spending time doing your own books possibly. And so that money goes very quickly. Those hourly fees have to be stretched over the entire year. So how should you charge? I'll say for these 4 options, hourly, daily, project-based, retainer, most grant writing consultants I know charge either hourly or project-based. And I'll tell you, you should do what works best for you. There is no one recipe. But most grant writers I know, or grants people, when they've started out in consulting, they have started hourly because it's just the best way to track what you're doing and make sure you're not losing money initially. And it's usually a fair way for your client to figure out how much you're going to charge them, because you may not have a great sense how long it will take you to write a particular grant. Although if you haven't left your office job yet, you might start tracking your hours just to see how long does it take me to write a HRSA grant, for instance, or whatever it is, so that you have a sense going into your consulting business how many hours it will take. Those consultants who have been doing it for a while might start charging a project-based fee. And I have to say there's some risk to that in grant writing more than other fields. There are some fields where you could take a tool that you develop and continue to churn it out and tweak it and give it to different clients. And when you're charging that same $5,000 per client, for instance, the time it's taking you to prepare that product is relatively less as you go on. With grants, as we all know, that's not always the case. Every year you've really got to start from scratch in many of them. But if you feel like you're somebody who, once you know an organization, can really work quickly and churn something out, and you may work twice as fast as most people, so an hourly rate may actually be a disadvantage to you. You may want to just charge a project-based rate and go from there. Other people determine their project rates because they think about the value that it's giving to their client, and they charge based on value as opposed to hours. But let's be honest, in terms of keeping our own incomes consistent, usually in your head, no matter how you're packaging your rates to your client, you need to go back and say, am I going to be making an hourly rate that will allow me to pay my expenses for the year? So that's really what it all comes down to. Okay, and finally, once you get the ball rolling, we'll go on to surviving and thriving.
Okay, and I think we've actually covered most of this already through our talking about being or becoming an associate or taking on associates, adding and eliminating and changing services. We've kind of covered a lot of this. I think being flexible is one of the key components of being successful as a consultant. And just as an example of flexibility, when Susan was talking about marketing, I really encourage you to track your marketing sources. When I started my business, I very carefully tracked where I got my clients, and I noticed that in the beginning, because I've been very active in AFP, a lot of my clients were coming through people I knew from AFP, and even people I knew in my career in banking sometimes were calling me once they heard I was in the nonprofit sector. Then I found as time went on, more of my clients were coming from speaking engagements. And now, even though, as Susan said, writing doesn't usually put bread on your table, not writing books or blogs or anything like that, but I find that my reputation as an author, I've gotten at least 3 clients who hired me because they read one of my books and called me and said they wanted to hire me as a consultant. So I think that's where you really had to be flexible. Your marketing might change. Your place of employment might change as you go, as you're in this a lot longer. Where you work might change. So I think the key is really being flexible. And I guess this photograph we put on here from Young Frankenstein has become sort of our mantra between Susan and I, because we often felt like this when we were editing our book. But it is a lot of being flexible, because you just never know what's around the corner and what's going to happen next. So before I turn it over to Susan to kind of wrap up, I did want to mention that I think we've answered all the questions that I see in the chat room now, but if you have more, feel free to send those along. And also, if you don't get your questions answered today, feel free to email us directly, and we can answer your questions one-on-one individually. So Susan, do you want to just kind of wrap up quickly?
Sure, I will. And I should say that, again, not to overtalk this book, but it really was not something that we did because we thought it would bring us a lot of clients, but because we were so passionate about getting more information out there in our sector to aspiring and novice consultants. And frankly, even for those of us who have done it for a while who are just craving more information. So the name of the book is The Nonprofit Consulting Playbook: Winning Strategies from 25 Leaders in the Field. It's coming out in a few weeks, and if you'd like to get specific information about it when it comes out, I challenge you to send a message to that very long email address at the bottom of the page, because Lysakowski and Schaefer are about 2 of the most difficult combined names to spell.
And if you can spell those both, you pass the test, right?
That's right. But we'd be happy to tell you, to give you notice when the book comes out. And we have also begun to offer hourly customized coaching ourselves to new consultants, because we realize that when you're talking to a big group like this, you can really only get to a certain level of detail. But please do contact us through that email, and we can get back to you together. I don't see any additional questions at this point. So thank you so much for attending, and I wish you all the best. This really is an exciting career for those of you who are passionate about the sector. There is so much that you can do to keep yourself interested and educated and to reinvent yourself over time. The options are really unlimited. So for someone who has now consulted through my children's toddlerhood and working from home and working in clients' offices, and it really can be an exciting next stage for any of you who are thinking about consulting. Linda, do you have any final words of wisdom?
I think just that I would like to wish everybody well in whatever area you are, and again to remind you to just email us directly, or I think Kelly also said you can email her at membership@grantprofessionals.org, and she'll pass along any questions. If you do have trouble spelling Lysakowski, Schaefer. And if you have any questions now that you want to type into the chat room, we have a minute maybe left.
Or feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute your line as well if you have a question.
Okay, great.
And it doesn't look like anybody's...
Yeah. I guess we
raising
answered
their hand.
them all. Well, we'll certainly wish you lots of luck. And I don't know, Kelly, do you want to talk about the next webinar, other webinars that are coming up? Or?
Yeah, sure. Well, let me finish with this first while I'm talking. That concludes our webinar. I'm going to shoot everybody over to the survey. Sorry about that. We'd like to ask each of you to remain with us a few moments longer and complete the short survey that you're seeing. Please take a moment to evaluate the webinar, the presenters, and provide GPA with topics for future webinars. We have all of 2013 fully booked up with wonderful webinars. There's about anywhere from 2 to 4 a month of webinars, and they're all listed on our website, grantprofessionals.org, under the Professional Development tab. You can click on the calendar button, and all of them will show up for you to look at. We don't open up registration until about a month before each webinar, and they all are free to all of our members. So make sure you check those out. We have them limited to 50 people per webinar, and so make sure if you see one that you want, get on there and get registered for it. We'd like to thank Linda and Susan for their time and willingness to share this information and expertise. Also, thanks to all of you who have attended. We're glad that you could join us and hope that the session was helpful for you. Later today, you will receive a recorded version of the webinar. Please take the time to visit our calendar again and view all of our future webinars in 2013. Linda and Susan will be, is it 1 or 2 more that you'll be doing? I think it's just 1 in December and then 1 in January.
I think.
That's
yeah.
right.
Correct, yeah. So make sure that you check that one out when it comes, and I hope that you all have a wonderful Tuesday.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, ladies.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Please stand by.